The universe. This is where creation began. So, what better place to use as a metaphor for the pedagogical approaches toward innovation and creativity used in schools today? In our solar system, all of the larger gaseous planets have rings circling them. However, most people only recognize Saturn as having rings because they are clearly the most prominent. Let's say Jupiter and Saturn both represent different styles of teaching. Let's start with Jupiter. The amount of knowledge students are expected to obtain is enormous, and the rings around Jupiter, or the creativity surrounding this mass of knowledge, is practically non-existent. From the greatest generation on, this is how students experienced their education in public schools. This was your school, baby boomers. Do you remember being stuck in class, being crushed by the gravity as your teacher controlled the information shared, limited your perspective, even controlled what thoughts could be freely expressed in class? The challenge now is for you, our baby boomer teachers, to move into a model of education represented by the planet Saturn. Saturn is still a large planet, just as today's pedagogy remains vast, but it is known for its several rings spanning thousands of miles. Your students don't need to be stuck on the surface of the planet. They can stand out on the rings, existing in a realm of creativity so as to gain a new perspective of the body of knowledge they are expected to learn. Let's discuss some of the ways you can break through Jupiter's gravity. Let's discuss how you can create an atmosphere of creativity and innovation in your classrooms. There are 3 areas you can focus on to develop a culture of creativity in your classroom. The first is question management. Yes or no, true or false questions do not encourage analysis. Those are close-ended questions. Rather, questions should be open-ended and encourage students to look more deeply at the lesson material. For example, if I were an English teacher discussing The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain, I could ask, did Huck Finn help Jim escape? The answer is yes, but this is not a good measure of how much the student read or has retained. If I were to ask, how did Huck Finn help Jim to escape? The students must then discuss what they have read in the text. If you are accustomed to presenting information and not asking questions, then remember that why can become your magic word. For example, if you're teaching about the Civil War era, you may want the class to know that President Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. More than presenting that information, you want your students to question the cause and effect leading up to the Emancipation Proclamation. Add the magic word why, and voila! You can now assess what your students have been learning up to this point. It also encourages the students to put themselves in Lincoln's position if they interpret the question that way. If this were a test, you could put the why at the beginning of the sentence and alter it to make it a question. Creativity begins with questions, so encourage your students to ask questions. We're all familiar with a student who asks a question just to get the class to go off topic. However, not all off-topic questions are the signs of a student trying to ruin your lesson. In fact, some off-topic questions are signs of divergent or interdisciplinary thought. Encouraging your students to ask questions will engage them with the material, and it will let you know how well you are presenting the information to your class. If you set aside 5 minutes or so to answer off-topic questions before a class change, you can still maintain a focused lesson through the majority of your class. With a set time for free discussion in class, other students who are less willing to ask questions during the lesson may be able to ask the questions they have at the designated time. It can also open channels to collaborative thought. Alternatively, you could set up a Facebook page so students could post these appropriate questions, and the best question of the day could receive 5 extra credit points. This encourages the students to be looking at the lesson materials at home as well as in your class. Ask interdisciplinary questions. This may not be the easiest thing to do in a high school setting. However, if the math teachers take the time to approach the art teacher about incorporating geometry into a lesson, the art teacher can ask students what geometric shapes they see in a painting. The math teacher may ask students about the symmetry of a shape once they've graphed an equation. For students who love art but not math, this will open up a new way of seeing math and vice versa. You will find that learning and interest in both subjects will increase. Connections with ideas and information are made on many levels. You can encourage students to connect with the material emotionally. Previously, we asked the question, how did Huck Finn help Jim escape? You might alternatively ask, how would you feel if you were in Huck's position? Help students connect physically by bringing props for a lesson. When teaching about Native Americans, you could bring an arrowhead. When discussing dinosaurs, you could make the fossil of a leaf with plaster of Paris. Have a corner of your room dedicated as a maker space. This could simply be a circle of chairs where students discuss ideas about what they've learned. It could be a puppet theater where they could act it out. You could keep craft supplies for making models. Anything that will allow the students to physically manifest what they have learned. Target as many intelligences as possible. If teaching history and touching on the cotton gin, you may ask students about the mechanism of the cotton gin. You may ask about the logical result of the invention of the cotton gin. The more types of intelligence you can touch on, the more students you will be able to draw into your lesson and have engaged with the material. Focus on your classroom culture. Show the importance of original thought by having students jot down thoughts and questions in an idea or creativity folder. Encourage students to discuss both sides of an argument. If discussing the Civil War, have students approach it from both pro- and anti-slavery advocates, regardless of which side they relate to personally. Include team projects because one of the greatest breeding grounds for creativity is collaboration. Create a trusting environment by allowing students to fail and encourage them to take risks. As long as the student's effort was sincere, their effort should be acknowledged as a step toward finding what works for solving a specific problem. Remind the students that even though they didn't find what works, at least they now know what doesn't work. Model creativity by solving a sample problem so students can see what the creative process looks like. As you focus on these 3 main ideas, creativity and innovation will flourish in your classroom. As students become more engaged, they will take more ownership of their education, thus lessening the strain on you.